Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by Kristen Costagliola with Syncro MSP. Is it Syncro or is it just Syncro or Syncro MSP?
It's just Syncro.
Just Syncro. So welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about identity, and I'm not even sure where to start because I think identity in today's world is all over the place. So give me your thoughts around where you want to start in the identity space, because, well, if we went down the CIS top 18 framework, we could narrow down real specifically. So are we talking user identity, or are we talking just identity in general?
I think mostly we're talking user identity, but we can talk identity in general. And thanks so much, Chris, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think when we look at what's happened in the industry, especially for IT professionals over years, for years ago, it was all about the endpoint, right? It was all about the on-prem device. It was all about the things that you had to monitor because you didn't know what was happening on the network. Today, that has shifted dramatically in the last 5 years, and it's so much less about the endpoint and on-prem. They're still important. The network is still important. There's still, unfortunately, we all have that file server or those, people
Right.
that have those things on-prem, right? But more and more today, it's about identity and the user, or service principal that's behind the scenes that's really taking actions in the cloud,
Sure.
not on the on-prem.
Right. We've really shifted from even desktop application as what the user needs to the application is Chrome or Edge or fill in the blank browser, and then something they pull up in a URL is the thing that they need to get to today.
Exactly. You almost don't even need to care about the hardware as much. Obviously, again, there are a lot of exceptions to that rule, but the fact is that most things you access today, almost everything that I access today, has nothing to do with my physical machine and all to do
Sure.
with my browser.
Yeah, you can quickly a machine that dies is replaceable in almost a blink of an eye, with probably even laying around hardware to at least get back to functional while you wait for the official replacement.
Exactly. And you can do so much now. You just drop ship it out, and you don't need to have necessarily a ton of different things installed. It's all about managing that user. And unfortunately, while that simplifies a lot of things from some management styles, it also adds a tremendous amount of complexity and in things that as people we aren't very good at. You think about when you had everything on your local machine, you opened the same application every day. You had your one
Sure.
password that you remembered to get into your machine. Today you have, 15 to 20 passwords that you
At
need to
least.
remember at least, and you have
Yeah.
to rotate them, and they have to be complex enough, and you're not supposed to reuse passwords. And you know uh, we all know people that it's hard, right? It's hard to do that. It's not easy to use a password manager, though some of our machines have definitely made that easier over time.
It makes me think about privileged access. It was very easy to say 4 or 5 years ago when you talk about desktop applications. I logged into my machine. In theory, I don't have privileged access to, install applications. I've got what I'm supposed to have access to. But when you talk about privileged access now, so many of the applications that a user has access to is by default privileged because you have access to it. It doesn't have the gated tiers like we're used to from the desktop world, where it's like, oh no, you got to log in as admin to make those changes. Your profile settings have to be updated by an admin user. Like, no, no problem. I have those privileges, right? And today, like, depending on the vendor's product, like, they're just giving you access to an interface, and all of your users may be privileged just because of the nature of the way the application was built.
Yeah, and the way tool sprawl is happening, and some vendors are better than others, like you're saying, and all of them are separate. So when you need to go update and say you have to offboard a user, or you need to transfer someone to a new role, all of a sudden you have to go to all of these different applications because
Sure.
a lot of times they aren't all combined in one area. Though I think that's where people are starting to really move towards and lean into, is leveraging things like Microsoft Entra for your SSO into
Sure.
absolutely everything that you possibly can.
Yeah, and there's that shift model that we see happening where, we've seen a slow adoption for things like passkeys and ways in which to reduce friction in some respects. One of the things I was recently listening to a podcast, surprise, and they were talking about the challenges that we have now are getting into, uh, you know, when we think about the passkeys and adoption there is going beyond that. Like, how do we ensure, like, do we need to really start emphasizing things like physical tokens where, we've got this in the digital world. I think we have an overload happening where we've seen plenty of examples, the duo or SMS, or like really overwhelming the user with, just acknowledge or just click yes, or like, well, I didn't ask for any of these things, but they keep bombarding me, so I'm going to say yes, and then boom, compromise happens. Are you seeing a shift where the physical key is becoming something that we really need to take seriously as far as how we help users navigate something that shouldn't be as complicated as it's become, but because of the way we that in Facebook land, it's like you get the thumbs up like and you're really happy about it. And I think this is the same kind of thing that's triggering our adrenaline, and it says, yes or no, do you want to, and it just keeps coming until you finally say yes. You're like, oh, I feel so much better about saying yes, even though it was a bad guy.
Yeah, I think so. I think the physical tokens, there's been a lot that have shown that MFA by itself is not as protective as I think it was before. Everyone
Sure.
was like, "Oh, I need to do MFA," so they implemented OTPs or SMS. And
Yep.
really, attackers can sit in the middle of a bunch of those things. There's
Right.
been proven man in the middles of session hijacking for any one of those things, and the physical keys do actually stop that. And so it
Right.
depends. I think like in everything, there is a balance, right? There's something that you have to you have to balance what is the right thing for your business, what's the right thing for the people that you're
Sure.
supporting, the customers that you're supporting. For our engineering team, yes, we have pass keys for absolutely everyone, and
Right.
we use YubiKeys. We use actual hardware YubiKeys to access specific things.
Right.
But for other areas, maybe that's not as critical. But it is really important that you can actually manage them and make sure that people are leveraging those, because you're right. Attackers are getting better and better, especially at phishing, and like the phishing attacks that I've seen personally, that I know others have experienced personally. Gosh, they are scary good these days. Like, they have access to things and information that really look real.
Well,
It's hard to always say no, and to have this suspicion of like what's happening. Um,
well, and the way they're exploiting today, like I think you have a background in development. You probably spent plenty of time in the FTP world, and I remember, you used to in FTP land, you'd type in your URL path for the FTP, and you put your username and password. You just type it into the string. I don't know if you've seen this, but they're now apparently that's part of the antiquated part of the protocol that is HTTP or HTTPS, where you can do the exact same thing. So you're seeing these phishing attempts where it's something FedEx.com at, and then they put the URL string after the user slash password. And so, of course, the user gets then prompted, because of the way they've built that, they get prompted to put their user and password in. Very simple. The user is unknowingly seeing the domain exactly as it should be, but it's being plugged in as the username, not as the actual domain.
yeah, it's like I'm saying, it's scary the things that they can do and the information they have access to, right? A lot
Sure.
of them are able to get access, so they hit you at the time that, you've just gone into FedEx or you've done something with FedEx, and
Right.
they have access to some of that, whether it's marketing data or like data that's from another something that's been compromised. And then they send those phishing attacks specifically because you're already kind of waiting for an email from support, or you're waiting for an email from FedEx, and people don't think twice because, that's what you were working on.
Well, I was joking about the Facebook thing, but I recently had this conversation with someone and said, you put a lot of information on Facebook about your travels, and I'm like, there's nothing wrong with that, but like, your example of like they know that you went to FedEx. Like I've seen people actually post like they have their package and the whole 9 yards of like just got done with my FedEx experience. It was great, and then just like that they're being targeted because they are being, I think we are all being watched. It's how quickly that information is being scraped when someone chooses to do something malicious. They don't need to target you or me. They just need to put some key data into a chat prompt and have it go and scour the internet for someone who has just posted that kind of information.
Exactly. And you know what the scariest thing for me of thinking about is, I have my 150 employees at Syncro, but when I think about MSPs and about the challenge of like I can have relatively good conversations with almost everyone at the company, right? To say,
Sure.
here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do. We can do phishing tests, we can do all of the things. We have a really clear guidance of who do you go to? What is your plan, and kind of, if you get an email, what happens. But for MSPs, for people that are supporting hundreds of people and all these different companies, that becomes the real challenge. And
Yeah.
while Microsoft gives us so much in so many ways with being able to manage through SSO, of at least trying to combine the entity into one area, the fact is that it also is not easy to manage multi-tenancy within
Right.
Microsoft. And it's really, really challenging to see what's happening between all of my different customers. And you think about everyone has leaned so heavily into EDR and MDR and like, let me monitor the things that are going on my endpoint. But the truth is that, like we talked about a little bit in the beginning, how much is really happening on those endpoints today? A lot of this is in your clicks, in your email, in your things that, today those EDR solutions are really not monitoring and not paying attention to.
Let's touch on that a little bit. I think that's you bring up Microsoft. The other one that obviously comes to mind that everybody's familiar with is the Google
Of
SSO.
course.
I think it's really interesting, and I'm guilty of this too, is you go to check out a new tool or a free trial, fill in the blank, and you're like, the options are create a username and password or choose from the Okta 365 or Google. And you're like, click, you get a pop-up that says this is going to give them access to so on and so forth. In some cases, it's very benign, like read only to your contacts or whatever it might be. In a lot of cases, though, it's like full read write access to not just your, say, OneDrive or 365 environment. It says it basically gives it carte blanche access to all of SharePoint or all of, and I think there's an interesting problem, I think, surfacing here that is an education that's easy to have with, say, the MSP or, like, to your point, your staff and your engineers of like understanding what permissions are when you add something from the marketplace or you add a tool that has built a backend integration for that single sign-on. But how do you educate the end user on, hey, not all, just because SSO is an option, doesn't mean SSO should be the option you choose.
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge, especially because it's so like you kind of have no win here, right? The SSO means that likely it's more secure because you get to control either conditional access or behind a VPN or other pieces that you can set up with your Okta or Google Workspace or 365. But it also means that it likely now has better access to all of your systems. And
Right.
so so really there's a big challenge of like what is better and what is the most important thing. And I think that's one of the pieces that comes into when you as the MSP are thinking about how am I setting up my infrastructure. Again, I think it's less about how am I setting up my network these days and more about how do I set up my conditional access? How do
Sure.
I ensure that when a user does access these things, their account only has access to very specific things that they need, or
Right.
and it doesn't go outside of their bounds, so at least you have a bit more. And then can you set up approvals? How do you set up approvals so that at least you're notified or you have information when someone has given access to be able to take a look at it?
I feel like there's two different ways that this happens though, right? So you have the website that you can go to that says you can use your SSO credentials to access this site versus I'm in like the marketplace where I've added an app that says, in order to use this app, please give your reason why. It goes to IT, and then they either choose to approve or not approve, because it really is accessing data. There is a real integration into the 365 environment or Google environment. But the other side, I think, is the one that is most troubling to me, is that we almost use that without thinking about what are the potential consequences of using it that way. Because to your point, it's like saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to put another window on the submarine." Right? Like as long as the submarine doesn't go below the surface, like you can have as many windows as you want, but as soon as you start going deeper and deeper in the water, those windows become somewhat problematic. I think this is kind of that, right? Like one is very visible, and your Microsoft tenant, you can see very clearly that this is happening. I think the visibility isn't quite as good when it's a website that says, "Oh yeah, we've incorporated, their way for authentication, so you don't have to remember another set of credentials, or it's just not." I don't know. Maybe I'm saying it incorrectly, but that's been my observation.
No, I agree. I think if you install like an enterprise application in 365 as an example, you can kind of go in and run a report and say, "Hey, what does this have access to?" But even then, Microsoft doesn't have a great overview of like,
Sure.
here are the 15 apps that all have access to your entire SharePoint drive. Are you happy with that? Like, is that something that you feel good about? That's one piece. And then what I think is really lacking is, here's all of your users and the apps that they've signed into with your
Yeah.
with your Microsoft credentials, and here's how you can manage that there. Because, again, in an offboarding situation, you can really clearly offboard their Microsoft account,
Sure.
but can you offboard the other random things that they've signed up for? And that's a real challenge within Microsoft.
Well, and
Well,
how
and
often are they
Google and
tested? Well, yeah, and Google, or the sites that create the opportunity for you to use SSO, and then you discover when you're logged in, you can go into like your profile settings, and you can go create user password or update password that's tied directly to the account, and suddenly you're not using SSO, or you can bypass SSO, and no one's really the wiser, because even though you have the SSO in place with Microsoft or whoever,
yeah, you
it
also
doesn't see
have.
what you did inside that application.
Exactly, exactly. Or you can sign in originally with a username and password and then
Yeah,
decide,
right.
and then, or be
Then
like
add it.
me, which is like, did I create a username and password for this, or did I sign in with my Gmail account? Let me just
Yeah,
figure that out, or let me try
I
that
find
and see.
I find those to be quite disturbing. Like you get to the site. I'll use HubSpot as an example. Like it gives you like seven options. No matter how many times you go to log in, you still have seven choices. And even if you put "remember me," it still gives you for authentication. You're like, which one was that from last time?
Yeah, and it's hard, and it's, in one sense it's a positive, right? That these apps don't necessarily know exactly which thing you're using, because then
Sure.
that gives attackers much more information of being able to say, "Oh, I can get your cookie, I can take your cookie, and that tells me you know, what SSO provider you have,"
Sure.
which gives them additional information. So there's always a balance here, I think. And I think this is one of the most challenging things with security and just IT in general in our space,
Right.
is that uh, you want to walk the line of what is the most secure and something that all of my customers and end users will follow. And
Right.
sometimes those things are not exactly the same. You can't give everyone uh, a hardware security token. They might lose it, right?
Right.
And that's the fact of it. But you also do need to take into account, hey, if we don't have MFA or if we have OTP, like this is something that could be compromised.
Yeah, losing a hardware token doesn't seem like the worst scenario to have.
Well, it doesn't, but it depends. I think if you're if your hardware token, if you have a good way around it, then
Sure.
definitely. And that's one of the things that I think we've been trying at Syncro to try to really help simplify for technicians is, you'd be surprised, or maybe not surprised, given your background, of how many people lose their MFA tokens. constantly, right? Like that is one of the most common things that technicians end up having to take care of. We looked at a lot of our tickets, and resetting MFA is one of the top ones. I got a new phone, or
Right.
I lost my MFA, and so giving people the way to reset that and make that easy for technicians is critically important.
Yeah, I just had I had an original VeriSign hard token with the 6-digit counter that finally died. So that would have been, I think I've had it close to 20 years.
Wow.
It finally, the battery finally stopped working in it. And so I was laughing and I thought, man, the world we lived in then when we were using hardware tokens to now, back then it was like that was really one of the only ways we had to do multi-factor or any sort of like, and today it's like pass keys, and well, your phone can be the token, and your Apple Watch is a hardware token. Are you
And
seeing any?
it is
Go ahead.
funny how things have kind of like come full circle, right? You like
With more
started
options.
with more options, but we went, I think from those, I had those, you had to
Yeah,
carry it around on your keychain and type in the 6-digit, and then we went to, oh, we can do that just, in any sort of password
sure.
manager, or it's an app. That was the Duo or the Authy those times. And then,
Yeah,
it was like, okay, now we're going to go back to those because we realized
right.
maybe those were actually the most important, that you have to carry it around with you.
This time we're going to charge you for them, because I
Yeah,
remember like when PayPal went to it and some others, it's like you just said that you wanted it and you'd end up with this token, like a keychain in the mail, and you're like, wow, this is great. And you go online and it's like $50 on Amazon. You're like, cool, I got one for free. Not quite seeing the free like we used to, and surprisingly how they are not cheap.
no, they're
I
not
I
cheap.
did I did have to purchase volume not so long ago. I think it was like 100 or 150 of them. I got the cheapest ones I could find, that basically the users I knew were going to just leave plugged into their laptop. But the reality was, if it was plugged into their laptop, it was only good while that computer was on and active. I mean, it wasn't the best scenario, but like they couldn't just go log in on another device unless they took that out of that machine either.
Exactly. And those were, I'm on the go a lot, as I'm sure you
Sure.
are. And those are
Yes.
great when you're sitting at your desk and I have my key plugged in. But the minute I'm on the go and on my phone, I'm like, uh-oh, wait, this is USB-C. My phone is not USB-C. How
I
do
can't
I
tap it either.
well, they say you can hold it on the back, but
Right.
I cannot get that to work for the life
It's
of me.
easier to do
So
my passport on my phone than it is to do an NFC token.
yeah. So, and so passkeys are something that are going to be really beneficial. And I think people are still going to continue to see uptake on those of, recognizing kind of the device you're on and being able to add that. Now, there's cons to that, of course, as there is with everything
Sure.
else, but
I feel like and maybe this is just, paranoia, but like, using your password manager, it's got all your passwords you log in to, then also use that same password manager for my passkeys. And I was just like, I feel like that just it doesn't sit well with me.
yeah, I mean, I don't, but maybe that's because I have a similar paranoia that, that you have.
Yeah,
I try really hard to not use the built-in password manager in my phone or in my browsers, just
yeah, I
because
definitely
I
don't do that.
definitely don't do that. So I have a separate password manager that's specifically for my passwords, and then my passkeys are separate from that.
Yeah, that's I think that's a good approach, at least today. Every password manager has had some drama in the recent past, so why increase my own drama?
Exactly. And it's going to change again. Passkeys didn't exist a couple years ago, that's a newer concept. And so I think we're going to continue to see this. I think this dance basically that happens right in technology is all about security attempting to stay a step ahead of attackers and staying a step
Sure.
ahead of what you can, and a lot of times I don't know that we are, but it's our goal to try to do as best as possible. And so
Yeah.
I think you look at a lot of the big providers of Microsoft and Google, and how do you manage the identity? How do you try to make things really secure? We've talked about a lot of the
Yeah.
negative parts of it. And the truth is that there are a lot of compliance and great options out there to help you build really good security practices. But it's not easy these days. It's really challenging, and things change a lot. And
Right.
so for MSPs, especially with the multi-tenancy, it's really, really tough. And so I think the most important thing that I would love to make sure people are paying attention to is to not discount identity, to not discount this idea that, oh, I have EDR or I have MDR, which so that means that I'm secure and that means that I'm safe. The truth is that that's farther down the list than maybe it needs to be. And I think today we really need to start looking at, are my users protected? Are my
Sure.
identities protected? And how am I doing that? How am I managing and protecting my Microsoft tenants, my Google Workspace, my overall? Are they as secure as they can be? And am I monitoring them to make sure that I understand if there is compromise, if
Yeah.
there is something bad that happens? And how do I
I
take
think
action
even
on that?
I think even are the users themselves conscious of the fact that while there is probably someone monitoring, you hope that there is, like, if it seems fishy or weird or doesn't seem to be responding right, like, don't ignore it. Like, tell somebody, because something's probably going on, because largely the tools themselves, it's really hard to make them act funny, the tools. Usually it's something around the tool, like not getting a response or not getting the SMS. Like, if you don't get the SMS message, you shouldn't probably say immediately, I should resend this. Like, that's just been my experience has been, if I need to resend it, did I even have a user account? Like, yeah, we have a few minutes left, and I want to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned, you said this a couple times, protect the user, protect the people, but then you also said protect identity, not necessarily associating with the user, because it could be an identity that's not necessarily tied to the user specifically, but is a identity that user needs access to. Maybe it's for backups, or maybe it's a jump box type thing. And you mentioned it from, like, we're seeing this now from the threat actor side, where when we've seen this, like with a phishing attempt, where there's no actual person behind the attack. It is pure play, an AI, some sort of scripted bot doing something aggressively malicious. How do you tackle that? Because I feel like the identity space has for a long time been very much associated largely with people. We try to focus on the people side, but we don't do a lot around identity in general. And from a switch to a laptop to fill in the blank has its own identity. And kind of, if you could just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that that is really important because you're right. It's easy to focus on the user as being the only identity, but it really isn't. It's anything that can access your cloud environment, your tenant, whatever word you kind of want to use in those areas. It could be a shared mailbox. It could be an endpoint. It could be, although, endpoints might be associated with users, but there might
Sure.
be a server that is an identity. There are so many different things out there that now are much more identities that you have to pay attention to
Sure.
in a grand scheme of things. And so I think that's exactly part of it is, one, you have to pay attention to the whole surface area. I think initially, again, years ago, if we compare this to where we were, everyone used to say, like, look at your network perimeter, right? What's your network
Right.
perimeter? What's your attack surface on your network perimeter? And that's where everyone was like, oh, we'll just set up a VPN and have nothing externally available,
Sure.
except for like one endpoint, right? And so then our
And the
attack
11
surface,
APIs.
I mean, right. Well, in an ideal world,
Right.
but today that doesn't exist as much anymore. Yes, VPNs are still a thing, and
Sure.
you still require those to access things, but something like HubSpot, like, you now have all of these SaaS solutions that your end users are using, that your servers might be accessing, that your shared groups might be accessing, that are things that identities have access to that aren't necessarily users and that you don't have control over. But the same concept applies that you had for the network. It's
Right.
just shifting the idea around it and learning, unfortunately, kind of a whole new technology and a whole new area of shifting it to the tenant. And so it's about limiting your attack surface in the tenant as much as possible. And so making sure that you have a really clear understanding of who, what, and why is accessing your tenant from all of these different locations. And again, those could be people, it could be endpoints, it could be there's many different things that could be accessing your shared
Whose co-pilot
environment.
is it?
Who what AI is doing this? What
Yeah,
there's what agentic solution is doing. There's all these different things today, and
sure.
I think it's only going to get more complex. I don't think that we're moving in a direction where we're going to see this simplify. It's just going to become more and more complicated, especially with AI. And so I think what MSPs can do today as a baseline is do an audit. What is accessing your tenants? What is the information that is happening? What are the identities that are important? And segmenting some of those into what are the most critical, exactly like you used to do with users and with devices of
Sure.
this server needs access to these specific things, but hey, this other one, it doesn't. It only needs
No.
access to these. It's the exact same thing. It's just in a totally different scale and just a different technology of using things like conditional access and things within 365 to actually manage that.
There's a lot of vendors out there, maybe not a lot anymore, that specialize in the RMM space, and I know that Syncro is one of those vendors. What's new and unique, and what's happening when we talked about identity for the last half hour? What's something to share with our listeners that would make them want to talk to Syncro, or just have questions about some of the things that we've talked about today, if they wanted to ask more questions about identity? Like, I think this is probably at the core of almost every MSP's thought process right now, especially if they're cybersecurity conscious and are looking at ways to improve their posture. I'll give a quick example and then I'll let you share. I had an MSP recently that was auditing API connections because they kept getting a notification that updates were happening in their PSA. And it was with a vendor that they hadn't done business with in almost 18 months, but they hadn't removed the API. And that vendor was still updating content inside their PSA, even though they were no longer
Wow.
under contract with that vendor. So, I mean, like, you can see how this can get really complicated really quick. MSPs are starting to look for how to reduce their threat surface when they add a vendor, when they remove a vendor. How badly do I need this API? What does the API actually have access to? Those kind of things.
Yeah. So at Syncro, we think of RMM as broader than endpoint. I mean, that's one of the reasons we're talking about identity. And so
Sure.
in our XMM platform, we think that our Microsoft 365 management and identity management should sit directly alongside endpoint management. And so RMM can't just mean managing your endpoints today and doing all of the things, which you still do need to do. That still is
Sure.
important. Yes, maybe it's not as important. A lot of people have really good processes for those things of policy management and everything you need to get done there. But we've also added on a full M365 management as well. And so we have security baselines that align with the SIS framework and run specifically across all of your tenants or any tenant that you want to connect to give you a report to say, how do your tenants align with the SIS framework standards? And how can you actually remediate any of those things to make sure that your tenants are as secure as they can be? And then we've also added in a bunch of identity management capabilities so you can automate and do things quickly like revoke sessions and block sign-in. And your technicians never have to leave the Syncro interface. So exactly where they're used to doing their ticketing and responding to any endpoint alerts or running scripts, they can also do things within the Microsoft console directly in the Syncro platform. So our goal is to help you kind of broaden your ability to protect your customers. Because the truth is, RMM, like policy management, endpoint management, and identity management are very, very similar. They have a lot
Sure.
of similarities. Again, they're just different technologies and different ways that you're implementing a lot of those things. And so our goal is to help customers be able to do that and do that seamlessly because while we love Microsoft dearly and they do a ton of things really well, multi-tenant management is not one of their strengths.
They have a few weaknesses, right?
They do, and this is one area that for MSPs is just like you said, it's on the forefront a lot of their minds and continues to be more and more important.
Kristen, where can people find you?
You can come check out Syncro at syncromsp.com and reach out. We have things socials and on Reddit. If you have any questions, please feel free to check us out.
Well, there you have it. Thanks for being on the show. For those of you listening, this has been an episode of MSP 1337. Thanks and have a great week.